Hi, welcome. I hope that this video finds you well and continue to stay safe. I want to talk today about contracts. Now, if you were to look up contracts on the Google or in a dictionary, does anybody still have a dictionary? But if you were to look up contract, you would see that it is a written or verbal, most of the times it's written, agreement enforceable by law. Oftentimes you'll hear the saying, if it's not written, it doesn't really exist. Verbal contracts are invariably easy to break. Written ones are more difficult to break. They are legally binding, however, both verbal and written ones being much more legally binding than verbal ones, because then it becomes he said, she said. But anyway, a contract is a written or verbal agreement between two parties that is legally binding. It can be taken, you can go to court and you can have it enforced by the court of law. Now, on the opposite of that, side of that, is a covenant. Now, a covenant is also an agreement between two people or groups of people, or like you'll have a covenant in your neighborhood of how your lawns are going to be kept and things of that nature. And it's a contract drawn up by a deed in the case of a covenant in a neighborhood, and it can be written down or it can be verbal, and it's an agreement that brings about a relationship. However, whereas a contract is a legally binding, usually a business kind of a deal, a covenant is about relationship. How are we going to live together, or how are we going to interact together in this relationship? Not so much legally binding, as many people who have dealt with covenants in neighborhoods have found out that if you sort of stop having certain things, they cease to be legally binding. But oftentimes you'll hear a covenant in a faith-based type of atmosphere. And usually you'll have a covenantal relationship in your friendships, or your marriage is a covenant where you promised how you're going to live the rest of your lives together. It's a faith-based accountability. We're going to make a covenant that we're going to hold each other accountable to read so many chapters of the Bible every day. Now, a contract oftentimes is a quid pro quo kind of a deal. You expect something in return. I'm going to give you this goods or services, and in return you're going to give me money or other services, or you're going to keep using me, or there's some quid pro quo, and that's usually in a contract. There can be in covenants quid pro quos. If you keep your lawn at this certain level, then the neighborhood will look at this certain way, and we can all get along. If not, then we're going to have an arbitrator come in, or we're going to have the board write you a ticket. They're agreements, but they're not quite the same type of agreement. Now, when it comes to God, God has a covenant with us, not a contract, a covenant. In the lectionary this week, if you look in the lectionary, they print it out for me. It's very convenient in four little segments out here. And if you look at it, there are several stories, and they're all talking about a covenant. In Genesis this week, you've got the story of Noah and the rainbow, how after the flood and it all has receded and Noah and his family have exited the ark, God puts a rainbow, a bow in the sky, saying that he will never again flood the earth and divide and kill the flesh with water. In 1 Peter and Mark this week, we have talk about baptism. Baptism is a covenant that we are making, or we are entering into with God. We're not making it. God has made that covenant, and we're entering into that covenant already in our baptism. And then in Psalm 25, it starts with, "To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul." This covenant that we are going to give ourselves, our whole selves, to God. We're going to lift ourselves up to our soul. And when we look at God's covenant, we can look at it in two ways. And sometimes we look at it as a contract, because we know what contracts are. We're very familiar with contracts. Who here has not signed a contract at some point in their life saying that they will do this. If you've rented an apartment, or if you've leased a car or bought a car, there is a contract. So we oftentimes think of God's covenant with us as a contract, a quid pro quo. If we do these things, God will do these things for us. We oftentimes will look at it as a friendship of equals. This is what the story of Babel is about people thinking that they can enter into this covenant on an equal level with God. And God has other ideas about that, and that's how we get the multiple languages. We think of it as a legally binding agreement, that if we do this, then God will do this. If we do this and God doesn't do this, then the covenant has been broken, and then we can go and do that. And oftentimes you'll read stories in the Bible are here in your church. Well, God didn't do this for me, so I decided I was going to do this anyways. And we justify our actions based on the fact that we think that this covenant is a quid pro quo. But God's covenant is nothing like this. It is not a contract. It is not a covenant of equals. It is not a legally binding agreement. God's covenant, whose is it? Well, it's God's. God fueled and God powered and God given. You'll notice I didn't say anything about us. We're not in that part of the covenant. It's not our covenant. It is God's covenant, first and foremost. And we need to realize that. Oftentimes in a contract, there's two parties, and each party can have a say in it. We don't get a say in God's covenant. God is the one who has placed it before us. It is God-powered and God-fueled. There is no agreement. There is no agreement. God didn't sit here and go, well, what would you be willing to do if I were to do this? No, there is not an agreement. God is saying, this is what it is. There are no terms, and there is no quid pro quo. God is not saying, if you do this, I will do this for you. If you don't do this, this is what will happen to you. And there are some rules, but there's not a clear-cut explanation of what will happen, is there? So there are no terms. It's not an agreement. We come into the picture when this covenant is presented to us in our baptism. Do we say yes or no? So that's essentially what it is. In our baptism, this covenant is presented to us. This covenant that is given by God, that is fueled by God, that is empowered by God. Do we say yes or do we say no? And this whole point of this covenant is not to create some agreement between us and God, or to produce a group of soldiers who will go marching off into battle in the name of God. It is to bring us into relationship. God's covenant is all about relationship with God. And here's the thing. We need to realize God does not need us to say yes. God does not need us to say yes for this covenant to be valid. Again, remember, it is God-powered and God-fueled. The covenant is not dependent on us. If we said no, the covenant would still be there. It would still be in force on this earth. We would still abide by it, whether we wanted to or not. Believe you me, I have tried the other side of not abiding by it and didn't want to, and God had other plans. Let's put it that way. It is dependent on God. It is God-powered and God-given by God. Okay? So this is the one thing we need to remember. When it comes to this kind of covenant, when it comes to God's covenant with us, when it comes to the covenant that we enter with God into baptism, it is God's. It is not us. It is not dependent on us saying yes or no. God does not need us to say yes. God wants us to say yes. God knows that we need to say yes. But God does not need us to say yes. God's covenant is not about equality. We will not be taken up onto the same level as God just because we do say yes. Or us getting what we deserve or what we think we deserve. That's prosperity gospel, really. God's covenant is about us being in a relationship. It's not about us at all. It's about us being in relationship with each other and with God for the purpose of doing God's work. It's about God. We are asked to enter into this covenant knowing this, that it's not about us, it's about God. Knowing that it's not about giving us anything, it's about us giving to others, about us spreading the gospel. It's not about us making us special. We are not special because we have said yes to the covenant. We are not special because we have said yes to the covenant. That is what Ash Wednesday teaches us. That we are not that special just because we get ashes put on our forehead on Wednesday. What makes us special is God. It's not about giving us understanding. As a matter of fact, the mysteries will still be there. We're not going to get answers in this covenant. We're not going to know how this is going to all work out. This is our mysteries of our faith, and we have got to be willing to accept those. So why do we say yes? Why did 10 years ago, or I guess 13 years ago now, did I say yes? Knowing all of this, knowing that I was going to enter in this covenant that I had no power in. This was not going to be a power structure. As a matter of fact, it was going to be me giving away power, giving away myself. Well, I can tell you why I said yes. I can't tell you why you said yes. But why did you say yes? Why did you say yes? Maybe that's a better question for us to answer during this Lenten season. Why did we say yes to God's covenant? Knowing all these things, knowing that it was not going to be a quid pro quo kind of an agreement, knowing that the power was not going to lie within us, knowing that we were going to basically make ourselves, as Paul puts it, a slave for Christ, why did you say yes? Like I said, I know why I said yes. And I share those reasons occasionally with folks and with you all. But why did you say yes? See, God's covenant is sort of a standard, isn't it? An all-encompassing kind of a deal for us. It's also unique and individualistic. So it encompasses the entire world. It is about the world and the kingdom to come. And it's also about us. Broad in scope and individual in scope, all at the same time. God's covenant encompasses us all and how we relate to God and as a people and individually. How we relate one-on-one with God. Corporately and individually. This is a pretty amazing covenant, if you ask me. It's a pretty amazing thing that God has put together and done and gives to us. And this Lent, perhaps the question is, how have you been in covenant with God lately? How have you been in covenant with God? How has that relationship grown or shrunk? Why did you say yes to God? Why did you say no to God's covenant? Because we have a choice. We can say yes or we can say no, and we can say yes to some of it and no to other things. God wants us to say yes to all of it, but we have that choice. We have free will. Where can your relationship with God grow? This Lenten season, maybe it's a good idea for us to ask ourselves, where can this relationship grow? Where can I grow in this covenant that is provided to me in my baptism, through my baptism, by God? Where has this relationship completely disappeared? Where are you failing to be in relationship with God? Where are you failing to answer the call of God's covenant? Where do you feel most comfortable in it? Where's your strong point? Where's that sweet spot where you know you and God are simpatico? Those are important to identify because it helps us also identify those places where we need to grow, where we need to sort of change, where we're not so on the same page. And this is what the Lenten season is about for us. This is why we take this 40-day journey, not including Sundays, to the cross to the feet of Jesus' cross. We do so that we can better understand this covenant that we have been given by God. God's covenant is about, remember, relationship first and foremost. So it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be spelled out and line itemed and if you do this, it's not going to be, it's about relationship, excuse me, with each and every one of us. And if you've ever been friends with a group of people, you know you relate to each and every one of them differently. And it's the same thing with God. God is going to relate to each and every one of us differently. Remember, it's broad and global and also individual. So how God is relating to the person sitting next to you might be completely different to the person sitting on the other side of you, and is completely different than how God is relating to you. And so we need to explore those, and we need to ask ourselves these hard questions so that we can grow more and more and more in God. And there's not rules to how this is going to happen. And this is what makes it difficult. That's why we oftentimes want to make God's covenant seem more like a contract, don't we? We want to make certain rules and check off points and I checked this box today, so I'm good to go. I checked this box today, so I'm good to go. And it's nothing like that. You see, it's about relationship. And relationships are messy. And they don't have rules sometimes. And we don't always know exactly where they're going. And sometimes we mess them up and we say the wrong things. And sometimes we get our feelings hurt. And sometimes we have extreme joy. And this is what God begs for us to enter into with God's own self. This covenant, this understanding that we will be in relationship with one another, that we will grow. So we're in relationship with each other, and we're in relationship with God, and we're in relationship. Oh, sounds so messy, doesn't it? But so worth it. So I'll ask the question again. Why did you say yes to God's covenant? Know why I said yes. Going to spend the next few weeks thinking about that and how that has affected my faith walk. And I encourage you to do the same. Explore that covenant that God has so graciously given you, that relationship that God is begging you to engage with God's self. Explore it. See where it takes you. I wish I could tell you where it's going to go. There's no road maps. It's an adventure. So have fun. Be brave. And know that no matter where you go, no matter how many wrong turns you take, no matter how far of a distance you have to travel, God will be right there with you, by your side, saying, isn't this covenant great? Aren't we having fun? Look how much you're learning. This is what it means to be a disciple of Christ, to be in covenant with God. Amen.